From the intersection of 218 and 80, with the rivers like our own that seek for seas they never find. I'm Aaron McNally, and this.
Hello, Curiosity Now listeners. This is Aaron McNally. Thanks for being here, and thanks for clicking like and subscribe. With me today is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, host of Culturally Determined on bloggingheads.tv. Aryeh, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, it's a pleasure. It's really excited to talk to you. I've watched many of your conversations, and I really enjoy your takes and the guests you choose and the questions you ask. So
thank you.
It's a real treat to talk to you.
I appreciate that.
Speaking about guests and topics, I heard something almost like a rumor, but I actually heard it on a podcast because everything, in this era, it seems like you're always got your ear to the ground anymore. But I listened to an episode of Megan Daum's podcast, and the Feminine Chaos hosts were there, and they were making it sound like you're sort of responsible for Feminine Chaos coming into existence.
I played a role. I mean, I'm not. It's that they're the ones who obviously are mainly responsible. I guess. I mean, part of the role I had was that I had. Phoebe had been on a couple times in the past. Connor Friedersdorf had Phoebe on because Connor knew Phoebe either from, well, I guess probably from Andrew Sullivan working on Andrew Sullivan's blog back in the day. And then I think I was the first one to have Kat on Blogging Heads after her piece about young adult, like the crazy things happening in young adult literature circa 2017 or so. And then I think there actually was one time where we planned to have someone have a conversation with Phoebe, and that person had to drop out. And then I think the suggestion was, let's get Kat as the replacement person. I can't even remember who the initial person was, but so that may have been part of it, is that I helped pair them up originally, and then they had the idea of doing something. They came to me, and I thought it was a great idea, and I, made the case internally at Blogging Heads for them to have a show. So I play some role, but it's more like very behind the scenes.
Well, it's good that what you did behind the scenes transpired, because it's an excellent program, and it's cool that you mentioned. I remember I listened to you talking to Megan Daum, speaking of her, and you were talking a little bit about that young adult lit controversy. You seem like you have your ear to the ground with respect to how politics plays out in popular culture. Would you say that's
it's something I'm interested in, for sure. I don't know how close my ear is to the ground, but I'm definitely interested in that. It was kind of when I started doing my own podcast on Blogging Heads. It was, one of the areas I wanted to think about. I think originally I was thinking I would want to keep it more as pure culture stuff, because there already was so much politics stuff on Blogging Heads, and just to do pure culture stuff. So like the first guest they ever had was a friend of mine from college who's a published poet, and we talked about poetry, and There was no politics in that one. I think
who was that?
Her name is Elizabeth Cantwell, and if you go to the archives of Culturally Determined and go all the way back, it was about 6 years ago. You can see that episode. We talked about why are the poems that are published in the New Yorker, are those sort of reflective of the things that poets are doing more generally? And
I have to check that out.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that was the first episode, and I think at first I thought this will just be sort of like the art section of the paper, but for Blogging Heads, and it evolved moving more towards politics. Probably part of it was, as the rise of Trump, and Trump, a figure coming from really more the culture, entertainment, media world towards the political world, mixed up a lot of these categories, I think. And so at this point I do episodes where I'm just really only talking about politics. I'm hoping, as the Biden administration, fully comes into power, I hope that, the stakes of everything seeming like the most important thing in the world, or just like everyone operating at a 10 alarm fire at all times. I think that's going to settle down somewhat, and then maybe you can just think about like a poem again and not be like, well, this poem is about, we need to relate it to, Russian disinformation or something. It just seemed like there was everything was so crazy during Trump's rise during his term that it kind of pushed a lot of things to the side.
Do you think that culture is kind of a luxury in that respect, or do you think you don't think it's essential then, or do you, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I guess I'm kind of interested too. In your show is called Culturally Determined. Is that supposed to be like a little bit of a play on words, or do you actually think that culture does kind of determine the tone and tenor for how we experience the world, including politics?
I think there's truth to all those things. I think is okay. The title of the show is sort of is kind of a pun, and it was good to get. When I was thinking of ideas for the show, I wanted to get something in there that would indicate what it was, and culture made sense. And I'm not. I mean, what's somewhat maybe not ironic or something. I don't know what, but that I'm really more of a. I think sort of like I'm more of a materialist when it comes to like how events unfold and what happens in politics, and I'm interested in how material factors shape culture and the interplay between these things. Whether culture is a luxury, I mean, it's in some ways it has to be. I mean, you don't. It's not something you. Well, I mean, culture broadly defined. You don't need to go to a museum or to the opera or something in order to continue living. So that's kind of a luxury in that way. But culture broadly construed exists all around us, and things that are just happening in the culture affect us in all sorts of ways. And so something else that I wanted to do, and I think I have done this somewhat at least throughout the show, is to focus on sort of like low culture, middlebrow culture, and high culture all together, and not so I grew up reading comic books, and I do enjoy comic book movies, so I've had episodes talking about comic book movies. I also am a huge Shakespeare fan, and I've had episodes about Shakespeare.
I'm so glad you brought up Shakespeare. I was definitely going to bring him up in this conversation.
So, strangely right now, the popular culture has been totally consumed by, superhero movies and things related to that. So that's strange, but like that is in its origin sort of like the trashiest, lowest culture, just these things that were made for, children and teenagers and cost like 5 cents, and you would read it and throw it away, and now it's like the mainstream culture is built around these things. And I mean, Shakespeare too was a popular in his time. It was sort of a vulgar thing to have plays, because like the upper crust writers were poets, and they were like purely writing for the ages or something, whereas the playwrights, it was like for the the commoners, or those people what were they called, the people who would like gather
peanut gallery.
But there's some is it something, I can't remember the term, but there's some term for the people who would like the cheap seats essentially, and they were like right near the stage, and and those are just normal people, and they were consuming this as we consume a movie now or something like that.
Absolutely, man. This is so great. I'm so excited you just jumped right into some of the things I was interested in. That it's not that theater wasn't ever refined. I mean, like closet dramas would be written, or like plays would be like John Milton's Mask would be performed for certain elite, like dinner party kind of audiences. But you're right. The actual popular play was something that was, it was rowdy in there. There were, probably possibly violent sometimes in the audience, and so it would be, speaking of Trump, who came out of, the man appeared in a professional wrestling episode,
Yes. I did an episode of my show a couple years ago about Trump's connection to professional wrestling and what.
I need to listen to that.
Yeah, too. that one is from 2017 or 18. I think it's with Owen Ellison, who is he's primarily a comedy writer, and I think he wrote on The Office. And but he is a WWF or EW fan, and so I had him on talking about that. But yeah, the interplay between what is real, what is fake, and what the audience understands as real and fake. Like,
Yeah.
Wrestling and reality TV and Trump are all like very closely related.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And if the listeners want to get more into how Trump exploited that in the context of the QAnon phenomenon, you just talked to Daniel Bessner the other day, and
Right.
listeners should really check that episode out because you got into, I think the title of it, you said, what did you say? QAnon is a symptom, not a what? I can't remember the title.
Yeah, the title of the episode was QAnon as symptom. I mean, he was making the case, which he wrote. He wrote an article in Jacobin about what drew people to QAnon, and his argument was from sort of a socialist perspective, sort of like the failures of neoliberalism and America's failed foreign wars, and so people embraced this alternate reality, sort of totally like this explanation totally divorced from reality is where some people went.
Yeah, well, and Trump, like this whole, you were saying, you watch a professional wrestling gig and the audience knows what's fake and what's real. And Trump used that kind of way of thinking about entertainment as a way to think about politics. Like he was like, oh, no, Sleepy Joe, he threw the election, he's got all these people to vote and he got all these fake ballots from these mail-ins and just got a bunch of felons to vote and, all this stuff. He just talked this like storm. And it's like, when he constantly called the mainstream media the fake news because, when he played the whole thing about the Russian disinformation that helped him get elected. He played that to his advantage to make people think that noteworthy, age-old mainstream media publications were just tabloid press. Like, I don't know where I'm going with that, but does that trigger anything for you?
Well, I think something I realized towards the end of Trump's term is that his, very early on, it seemed like the enemy that he was going to be attacking the most was going to be like Mexicans coming across the border illegally.
Which is very easy, right? From a good guy, bad guy thing, you can just paint them. They're a certain color. They're coming from a certain place.
Exactly. He had that famous statement. They're not, they're sending rapists and
somebody's doing the raping. He said, "Oh my God."
Yeah. So that seemed like, that was an early thing. And then he also was, very anti-Islam. And, the first real thing he did after he became president was the Muslim travel ban. But as time went on, really the chief villain in the reality, the wrestling, WWE wrestling world of the Trump presidency was the media. And they were the ones that he cared about the most. They were the ones he demonized the most. And, he stopped talking. He wasn't talking about the scary Muslims who are going to blow us up or the scary Mexicans who are going to steal your job or rape your wife or something. He was the lying media. They're the enemy of the people. And that was, I don't know, the question of how much Trump has sort of some sort of actual strategy, or he's just sort of going on instinct. But he delegitimized the media for a lot of the Republican base, and I think that's probably going to be more or less permanent. That people, people on his side already distrusted the media, weren't big fans of it, but he made it he made them enemy number one. And it wasn't he could have you could have imagined a campaign that he ran in which he was really demonizing illegal immigrants constantly as an enemy within, and we need to round them up. And obviously they were very heavy-handed in arresting people, but he spent a lot more time insulting the media, the failing New York Times, MSDNC. And a lot of this, I think, is, it's his strange psychology and his obsession with the media, and the fact that he really was much more a media figure than a actual business figure, or anything, and he was totally obsessed with media coverage and how he came across, and grew out of this like tabloid culture in New York City in the 70s and 80s, and it's all very strange. But yeah, his that was really the enemy, like the people who were storming the Capitol. They seem to think the enemy was okay, Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats. That makes sense. The deep state pedophiles that in their imagination, like are secretly running the government, and then also the media. And there were these images of them, like grabbing people in the crowd, like grabbing cameras and smashing them on the ground. And if you listen to some of the people who are reporters talking about what happened there, people would be like, they like feared for their lives, and like were saying, like there was a podcast I listened to with the reporter Ellie Reeve, and she was saying like she was glad that she had a very small camera with her instead of like the big camera, and also she wasn't wearing like a CNN name tag or anything at the time, because she thought like that would make her an explicit target and she would be assaulted. So that's the sort of like rage that Trump whipped up in the minds of his most fervent supporters. So that's very bad.
Yeah, it is very bad. I don't want to make this whole conversation about Trump because I really want to get over this guy.
Yes, I do too. It's fucked up how, I don't know if we can curse on this. Sorry if.
Go ahead, please do. F-bombs abound.
Okay, so it's just like his we had like 5 years of basically him being in our brains all the time, and now he's no longer president. He's no longer on Twitter, but like
free.
Yes, but like the wounds remain. It's like we're still somehow stuck thinking about him and how his what he's gonna do, and all the strange things that happened over the past couple of years. We're like still stuck within this. And I joked a while ago on Twitter that anytime you're on your phone and you're trying to type out the word truth, it's gonna auto suggest Trump, and he's gonna be with us like. He's a part of American history forever. Like you can't just pretend this didn't happen or cut him out or something. Like he's here for good.
Yeah. Bannon's dream was actualized. Oh my God, it's horrible. But the GOP is not making it any easier. I mean, when you have like when the National Review is not looked at with respect by the Republican Party, and for whatever you think about the several legitimately unsavory aspects of the National Review, at least it was. It was a publication of note for quite a bit of time. And I understand that era's past and Buckley died quite a while ago, but still, like, what's going on with that party?
Well, the National Review published a cover story at some like March 2016 called Against Trump. And they had like 20 prominent conservative writers, intellectuals making the case that, Trump, like, just totally against Trump. That was the title, and it failed, obviously. And so that showed that like the intellectual, like media class of the conservative movement was pretty divorced from what people on the ground actually wanted.
Yeah,
and some of those people, I think like Glenn Beck I think he contributed to that, if I'm remembering correctly. So he embraced Trump. Other people became the Never Trumpers. Some kind of stayed in between, and yeah, but it just showed that like the people who were purporting to be like the intellectual explainers and thinkers of this movement really were like doing something separate from what was happening in the grassroots and on the ground.
I have a theory that the comedian Norm Macdonald is almost outspokenly conservative. He doesn't like to get into it because he gets in trouble every time he talks about it. But he did do a lot of politics when he was on SNL for a while. But my theory is that when he did the Colonel Sanders commercials for Kentucky Fried Chicken,
right?
That Glenn Beck really liked those commercials, and then Glenn decided he was going to style himself after Colonel Sanders. What do you think about that theory?
That's interesting. Yeah, he definitely kind of assumed a different. Like after he sort of his initial rise and fall, he kind of like
the guy had a favorable article written about him in the New York Times.
Yes,
because that was against Trump at first.
Yeah, that was a mistake, but he kind of bamboozled people, being like, "Oh yeah, Glenn Beck has learned his lesson" or something. But yeah, he kind of like became more, I don't know, like your kind of kooky uncle was how he was trying to present himself. Like, yeah, just a much more like he's wearing sweaters instead of suits or whatever. But yeah, he, I don't know, it's hard to know what that guy actually believes, or like whether he's like in on the grift or a true believer, or some mix of it. I guess some mix of it probably, but yeah, he's I mean he's is sort of a precursor to like the conspiratorial stuff that has taken over part of the GOP.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But and one of the things that your conversation with Bessner last week brought up for me, and again, I advise listeners to check out that episode. You were both talking about how there's this era of contrarian punditocracy that maybe isn't as productive as as it could be, right? And maybe we're kind of cycling and spiraling. Speaking of culture and politics, I mean, how much of the when I look at I kind of vaguely looked into, like, as a writer, politics are appealing because they're perennial, and every day there's new politics to write about, so it's a lot of grist for the mill.
Mhm.
And, so I looked at politics and I looked at pundits, and, there's the whole racket, and, this in the Zoom era, you can actually get on TV if you get an article out there, just because you can film from your house. So if there was ever a time that a guy in Iowa might be able to get on national television, it would have been 2020. But when I looked at punditocracy, I didn't think it was ethical. I didn't I didn't want to get into it because you have to peg yourself as having a shtick, and you have to have takes on everything. And you had this nice talk with Megan Daum about how she retired from the business. She's doing long form
Right.
now. She's not doing columns anymore. And I'm with her. Do you have any feeling about that industry that really grew up with the Rush Limbaughs and the AM radios and the CNNs and because let's face it, for as resistance oriented as all the MSNBC and all that was, they had good years for ratings during Trump. And what's going on with that? Is that good? Is that healthy, or do we need a new idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely true that MSNBC, in sort of like base material terms, benefited from the Trump presidency because more people wanted to watch Rachel Maddow, etc.,
Yeah.
to get the anti-Trump line, and Fox News benefited from Obama's presidency in the same way. I kind of like, in some ways, like grew up watching cable news, and I remember I used to come home from school in high school, and there was a show on CNN that was called like Talkback Live or something, and it was like a call-in show, but the different topics. And I think this woman named Bobby Batista was the host, who I think actually passed away a couple years ago. But anyway, I would just like turn it on and watch it because it was on, and I was like vaguely interested in this stuff. As I'm sort of disconnected from the cable news world because I like was a early cord cutter, I guess, and haven't paid for cable television in a dozen or so years. So I really don't watch it, and anytime I do see it, it sort of like drives me crazy because of how bad it is, and so I have to stop watching it.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think that is pretty much bad. I mean, Fox News is definitely bad. MSNBC is maybe slightly better because they do have some commitment to truth, but also they're serving things to their audience. I mean, CNN, I guess, is the best of the three, but that's not saying much. And in fact, I don't know if you saw or listened to the episode that Bob Wright at Blogging Heads did with Eric Alterman about.
Oh yeah, sure did. Yeah.
Yeah. So he said something that really struck me, which was that what is like the news, reporting the news, what is it supposed to be? It's supposed to be telling the truth as best you can understand it.
Mm-hmm.
CNN puts on things, they'll invite the Republican commentator to come on, and he says his piece, and then they never say like, well, that wasn't true. They just let him say his piece and don't attempt to rebut him, because then he's not going to come on next time or something, or they'll piss off whatever remnant of the conservative audience they still don't have. So in Alterman's telling, CNN isn't news; it's entertainment, because it's not. They're not committed to the truth. They're committed to keeping you watching and ratings, and that really struck me as powerful and accurate. And yeah, there's a lot more things that are just want you to keep paying attention. And if we the various groups and organizations that enabled the rise of Donald Trump, like cable TV, is one of the top 5 probably, because they would air his rallies live unedited, because they thought something crazy might happen at any time, and then they'll be rolling, and so people have people who are watching in the middle of the day felt like they had to tune in also to see if some crazy thing would happen. And I'm sure they didn't think at the time that they were objectively helping Trump become president. They were like, this is just great TV. And so yes, that's more what they seem to care about. In terms of like takes and so forth, I don't know, it's like the blogging hits grow out of the blogosphere. Obviously there was kind of like a hot take era where at Slate or in a blog post or something, you would like write a counterintuitive opinion, or a kind of different take on what the latest event was, and so you would garner attention that way because people would want to read your latest thing if it was provocative or entertaining in some way. That has like been compressed by social media into like the take cycle is like mere minutes or something, where like something happens, everyone on Twitter comments on it, and then they're sick of talking about it 45 minutes later or something, and and something moves on, and there's no time to actually like reflect or digest or whatever. It's just like on to the next thing. So that's another bad bad development of the modern information ages.
Well, you definitely brought up another topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which is Twitter. And speaking of need and time to digest things, I'm going to conflate a whole bunch of shit right now, and we'll see if we can't parse it out in the next few minutes. So you mentioned Alterman saying, that the news is more like entertainment. And that's also, I also noticed him saying that. And it's an observation I'd actually had myself. When I heard him say it, it resonated with thoughts I'd already had. And so I guess from a culture perspective, I'm interested in what you think about. It seems, okay, so we were talking earlier. Let's set Twitter aside just for the moment. Okay. We were talking earlier about, is culture essential, or is culture, just the icing on the cake, a sort of almost frivolous thing. How does entertainment fit in with culture for you? And what are the problems that you see, let's say hypothetically, for a modern democracy, when your quote unquote news starts to become entertainment?
It's definitely bad. I think, it's probably started long before Trump, and Trump, the mentioned this episode title QAnon as symptom. I think one of the core questions about Trump is like, is Trump the cause or is Trump the symptom? And if he's a symptom, what is actually happening that enabled him to rise? And so it's both in some ways.
Enable is the perfect word.
Say that again?
Enable is the perfect word.
Right. And so, there were things, a metaphor I used early in 2016 was that like, Trump was like some sort of virus or pathogen, and the GOP was like someone who had cancer but didn't know it. And it was so easy for Trump to take over the GOP because like the GOP was practically dead, but didn't realize it. And then the parasitical Trump was able to go in, and you can sort of say the same things about other realms of life, where like things were messed. Like in order for, I think I said this in the Bester episode, in order for someone like Trump to rise to the presidency, clearly there were some things that were very like sick or broken within the system beforehand, or it never would have happened. So
100.
And you can reel them off. News is entertainment, 24-hour news cycle, a conservative media infrastructure that will parrot like whatever the latest line is, whether or not it's true. The growth of reality television. I mean, if I've said this before, if it weren't for The Apprentice, there'd be no President Trump. That's like the key thing that enabled him to become who he was in 2015, 2016, because he was basically a washed up, real estate developer who in the 90s made cameo appearances in Home Alone 2 and Fresh Prince of Bel-Air before that. And yeah, so there's a lot of stuff, like that was maybe seen at the time as sort of like somewhat bad, but not horrible, like reality TV, like, oh, it's trashy. We all know that it's encourages bad behavior in the people who are on it. And then the same person who wants to someday, become a cast member of The Bachelorette or whatever, like, they mold themselves to become this sort of person. It's like there are all these things that seemed detrimental overall to American society, and then like Trump's rise showed like, oh, this is even worse than we thought before. But I don't know. I almost feel like the splintering of the media that the internet enabled, and just all these sort of trends that were flowing from information technology and the economy. I just think I don't know if it can be put back together again, and sort of the I have no idea if it seems. I'm sort of a pessimist when it comes to that stuff, that like the system is just so broken that it's not, it can't possibly be fixed. I mean, if you look like a rampaging mob of people carrying Trump flags and wearing MAGA hats broke into the Capitol, beat a cop to death, like seemingly wanted to like kidnap or lynch the Speaker of the House and the Vice President, and it's sort of people. So like any normal person seeing what happened on January 6th had to be like freaked out and disgusted, and just been like, this is horrible. And 3 weeks later, it's almost like we want to move on. This will linger in the past, and there's some percentage of people who just think like, oh, actually this was a false flag operation run by Antifa or the deep state itself. And I don't know. So I like throw up my hands at that point. Like this was, if this event is not going to convince a certain group of people that, a lot of things went very, very wrong during the Trump presidency, then I don't know. I don't know whatever would. I mean, thankfully no like members of Congress or or members of the administration or anything were actually assaulted or killed. But maybe if that had happened, that would have been more like you couldn't dismiss it, because there's a type of person, speaking of contrarians, there's a type of person on Twitter or something like, who's sort of on the Michael Tracy, Glenn Greenwald side of things, who are kind of like, oh, this was just a sideshow, like, it wasn't that bad and we shouldn't worry about this, because they have, they don't want to acknowledge that like Trumpism was run to the core or something like that. But yeah, so I don't know, like if this isn't the shock to the system that could somehow change things, then I don't know whatever could be.
I want to come back to the theme from before, because I think it's relevant here. You were saying, I throw my hands up at this point, right? If I can't have a sober conversation with a person at about something like this, right, using reason, right, appealing to sensibility, then I really have no choice but to throw my hands up and just choose not to converse with them, because it's just what would be the point? I would just be burning energy on a lost cause. So we've been talking about whether or not culture is frivolous or whether or not culture is essential, and I want to get into, you called yourself a materialist, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to get into this recently, and I would like to disclose to the Curiosity Now listening audience that though I may play an intellectual on my podcast, I've never read Hegel. I've never read Marx, okay? But I have heard Robert Wright and Mickey Kaus talk about base and superstructure. And you were talking about material forces. And what I hear you saying is that there's an issue with how we're seeing reality. And it's influenced negatively by some kind of media / technological like shit show. And that's altering our ability to have rational dialogue. So I say to you, or I ask you, is there a way that we can use culture to change that through messaging? Or do we have no choice but to have some kind of revolution where certain types of people in charge are just simply taken out of the picture, and we have a new system for obtaining our information?
Well, I mean, sort of the so I'll confess, I actually, maybe aside from a few sentences, have not read Hegel either. I did read some Marx in college, but I think Hegel is famously very difficult to read, and I only took one political philosophy course in college and didn't like it very much. But I have read a little bit of Marx, and I think there's like a bunch of people in politics who are committed to Marx's ideas, and there's not really a bunch of people committed to Hegel's ideas, as far as I know,
including neocons. Strangely, that there are like former Marxist. And anyway, go ahead.
Right. So, but as I, this is sort of like someone who like read a syllabus of a class on these topics is essentially where I'm coming from. But like, do the Hegelian ideas, like there's these ideas that are in the zeitgeist and they sort of like clash, and then there's like an idea, there's the antithesis, there's the synthesis, and like history moves along through these like clashing of big ideas and finding some like new dialectic, and then like the dialectic dissolves. Whereas Marx,
and there's a master slave aspect to the dialectic.
I see. Now maybe you know more than I do about Hegel. But
I've watched too much YouTube. That's
and then the Marxist interpretation of the unfolding of history is more like about material conditions, different social classes, and I think I imbibed a lot of Bob Wright thought in my life, having consumed almost all of the blogging head's oeuvre over the years, and also reading almost all of his books, and especially his books Non-Zero and The Evolution of God are kind of about how
both great books.
Yeah, about how like these material, technological determinism and material conditions are more important than ideas in the way like history unfolds. And
for Bob, he's into memes. That Dawkins idea. He thinks ideas get passed on like genes, right? But they get passed through the culture, and it's not so much important who the great mind is or whatever. It's what ideas are efficient and survive the competition of natural selection in his mind.
Right, and so part of it would be like there was a book that came out in the 80s or 90s that was something called like How the Irish Saved Civilization, and it was about how these Irish monks like were the last ones who like had the copies or the translations of like the ancient like Aristotle and so forth, and all these and because Ireland was like they were able to maintain these texts from antiquity that later, like during the Renaissance and so forth, other thinkers drew on, and the founding fathers in America drew on. And so that's an interesting and compelling idea. And Bob said, no, these ideas, like someone else, if that never happened, then if those Irish monks, accidentally burned all the papers or whatever, like these ideas, the good ideas still would have like bubbled up, because the logic of like non-zero interactions between people would promote various ideas. And so like so that sort of is against the great man theory, because it's like, well, if there never was a Plato or an Aristotle, someone else would have come up with this more or less the same thing at some point in history.
Right.
And and that the various information technology things and various ideas would over the long span of human history, these ideas would have bubbled up because they just make more sense and lead to like win-win situations between different groups. So like representative democracy would be an idea that leads to better outcomes than authoritarianism. This is Bob wrote this at the end of the 1990s, and that was also sort of the end of history moment. I think maybe he would change some thoughts about this, especially that sort of perspective at the time made it seem like, well, eventually China is going to like move towards democracy as they embrace the same sort of information technology and market reforms that we have in the West, and it seems to have moved in the opposite direction. But anyway, I think that is that's informed my thinking of how these things play out, and there's an interplay between culture and materialism, and especially information technology, where it's like, what sort of ideas are popular in the age of Twitter? The form and the way this site is coded, it encourages like really extreme ideas. Because if you tweet something like, I just saw the new Avengers movie, I thought it was okay. No one's gonna retweet that. If you tweet,
I will retweet it. Just want to be clear. If you ever put that out there, Aryeh, I will retweet it.
Or if someone tweets like, I just read this book and I don't know what I think about it, why would I retweet that? Like, that doesn't do anything for me if I retweet that. But if I say I just saw the new Avengers movie and it's the worst movie ever made in the history of American cinema, then that can go crazy, that can go wild, that can go viral. Or if I say say the opposite, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen, and if you don't like this movie, then you deserve to be shot, like that will go viral also. So so sort of just like within any politics, culture, anything, like Twitter encourages emotionalism and extremism. And getting back to Donald Trump, like there's a reason he did thrive within that ecosystem. Like his his skill set is towards a brief, emotionally charged, hyperbolic statement, and so he that Twitter's another thing that helped him rise.
Well, he's famously good at Twitter. I mean, I remember seeing Elon Musk on some show, and some lady that was horribly sexist to me. So some journalist was asking Elon Musk of something, I don't know, something about Trump and his Twitter game, and Elon Musk was like, "Yeah, the president's really good at Twitter." And it was like an affront to this journalist. They were very upset that he would acknowledge this just like basic objective reality that the guy this all ties into what we were talking about earlier with cable news and the beginning of the sort of proliferation of Fox News played on something that AM radio was already doing. And that was, there's certain people that want to hear these types of stories. And if we give them to them, they're going to tune in, right? We can get market share, right? And they started to see that. And then, other cable news networks responded. And then it's just a sort of natural progression as complexity comes into the system, as more and more avenues for communication emerge. There's more and more opportunity for individual viewpoints to come into being and to attract small clusters of people who support. But it's not that different from in the 19th century, a town having 3 newspapers, all of different political affiliation, right? It's not that different from that basic concept. It's just that your town's Democrat newspaper versus your town's Republican newspaper, they don't have their little circulations of 2,000 or whatever. Now they can go global, even with that Chinese government censure, you still might be able to bootleg that blog from China even, So Twitter's like, one of the things that came to mind while we were talking about the entertainmentization of news, quote unquote, news media, I was thinking, is it really entertainment, or is it more like addiction? And Twitter is just like it just seems like Twitter is just like the manifestation of all the things you could be concerned about all of the different media. Twitter, just like this guy, Jack, happy-go-lucky beardo meditating, he just stumbled on this thing accidentally that's like the worst possible confluence of all the bad aspects of the entertainment news media, where you can just go say your shitty thing. People who like it will like and retweet that shit. People who don't will quote tweet and bash you, right? And it's just tailor made for a shit show.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, when Elon Musk was saying Trump is good at Twitter, yeah, that could be like saying Trump is good at, like, murdering animals or something.
Yeah,
Like being good at Twitter is, we should not say that this is like being, like a good, portrait painter or something. Like, it's kind of
exactly.
objectively bad, and I think Twitter itself is like 95% bad, 5% good. And it would be better if if someone could snap their fingers like Thanos in the Avengers movie and it disappeared from reality. That would leave us in a better state. I mean, it's definitely it has all these aspects to it that make it addictive. It's sort of gamified in a way, and like saying things, you tweet something and then you're waiting to see what the reaction is, and if people like it and retweet it, it gives you this like tiny little burst of dopamine or something in your brain. And if no one likes it, then like you feel a little bit bad, but you can move on to the next one. But as I've joked on Twitter, like, the best thing that can, if you write a really good tweet and it goes viral, the best thing is like you feel a little bit good for like a couple of minutes, and then the worst thing that happens is that your life is ruined.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
if you tweet the wrong thing, then you're fired. You're a laughing stock. You're the bean dad. I don't know if you are if you saw the bean dad guy.
We'll see how much, whether or not Will Wilkinson makes more money off his Substack or not.
Yeah, I mean, well, okay, so
got fired from his think tank.
Just in the past few weeks, Will Wilkinson tweeted what was either a joke in poor taste or just a joke that has some violent imagery in it, and ended up losing his think tank job. And that seemed like a total overreaction. I mean, this fits into the whole like cancel culture thing, but yeah, anything. But what's strange is that it's like, and I'm trying to still it defies logic, the fact that like anyone would like continue to be on Twitter given the possible downsides. It's like playing Russian roulette, with
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, because I mean, you're on Twitter.
I know, it's horrible. It's horrible.
Well, do you feel like that's an addiction, or do you feel that you
in
need
some ways,
to do
yes, yeah. In some ways,
something, or
like I said, it has a sort of gambling like quality to it, and it's like that. There's some famous experiment in psychology where they had like pigeons or rats or something, and when they press the food lever, you could do it where they press the food lever and they get the pellet, or you could set it up that it's kind of like a slot machine, and they hit the food, they hit the lever, and nothing comes out, nothing comes out, nothing comes out, and then suddenly like a bunch comes out, and they found that was like the most addictive.
Yeah,
it's people would, and they would like keep on, the rats and the pigeons would keep on doing that over and over again, hoping to get the big payoff, even if they get a bunch of zeros over and over. Yeah. So that is sort of the average person's experience of Twitter. Is mostly it's nothing. I mean, if you're tweeting yourself, you can just be reading it, of course, and that's probably what most people are on there are more like participating that way. But yeah, it's definitely bad. It's definitely affected my life in positive and negative ways, but probably a net negative overall. And I think if I was thinking when the Biden administration started, I would at least take it off my phone so I wouldn't have it in my pocket all the time. I haven't done that yet. I might try. I think I'm gonna at least try that and see how it works out, so that I can just get away from it more. And yeah, I think it's definitely. I mean, it's objectively bad, and it's also bad that like the realm of life that it captured the most is like the news media. And if you actually are in the news media, you have to be involved with it to some extent to know what the latest breaking news is, or the latest thing people are talking about. So yeah, and it's distorted. It's distorted the media in the same way it like distorts everything else.
Matt Lewis had a Selena Gomez, I think that's the reporter's name, on his podcast last year, and she got off Twitter. She's a conservative, and just she'd had such unsavory things said to her for posting what she thought was straight news from her vantage.
Mm-hmm.
And Matt was saying, I don't think I can get off Twitter. I kind of need it for my job.
Right.
And I have this tiny podcast. My reach is very small, but I'm going to tweet this, and I'm going to, hopefully Aryeh will retweet my tweet. We'll see if he liked the conversation enough to do that. And it's just one of those things, like, how else are you going to get your message out there but to try to tap into at least an algorithm of some sort? I mean, Instagram just doesn't work the same for podcasts, and Instagram has its own problems. And, that's probably partly why we're also, people realized the things you could capitalize on Twitter, and they, by golly, capitalized on them. And, now we made the bed, we got to sleep in it.
Yeah. And the podcast in particular, there still hasn't, it's still very reliant on a certain like limited number of gatekeepers, like the Spotify and the Apple podcast app. Those things are like, if Apple somehow chooses your podcast to be featured, that's like huge. That's like, maybe you could like actually make some money off your podcast or something if that happens, or you'll have a chance of big success. But there's no, it's hard to discover new things absent that, and it's hard to break into it if you don't have some institutional support absent that. So like if the New York Times starts a new podcast, I assume they have a relationship with Apple, and like they'll be featured or something, or people just find it because it has New York Times in it. If an everyday person wants to start something without some institutional relationship, even though like the podcast is almost like the easiest thing, one of the easiest media products you can make yourself, it's still hard to have people actually find it absent someone at Spotify or someone at the Apple podcast app selecting it. So it's so there's still gatekeepers in the like traditional media sense in the world of podcasts, whereas like Twitter, anyone really can more or less, like if you have the skills, you can sort of like finagle your way in and like get some amount of following on Twitter. Although, like I said earlier, those skills are not like necessarily morally praiseworthy skills or one you would want to teach your children. It's more like the dark arts of, manipulating other people's emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Substack talks about how, if you want to build your follower base, it starts with your associates, your people, on the ground, talking about your mom and pop relationships, and building those up. And I think maybe part of the 5% of good of Twitter is that dynamic that it's like, I follow people who are like me, and they follow people who are like them. So I can get in this little ecosphere and drop a link in there, and, maybe a dozen people will check it out, maybe not, but it's worth a try. And that does seem to be fairly praiseworthy. But on the flip side of that, there's this idea, you were mentioning how the gambling dopamine response can play into lever pushing exercises. Another, there's this guy, and I cannot remember his name, but he's got this famous statement about the nature of addiction. And he says the opposite of addiction is connection. And he was talking about this experiment done with a rat park where somebody made a very convivial social, pleasurable, productive, kind of fun, lots of opportunities for play, for communities of rats
Okay.
to be in. And when they compared Rat Park to isolated rat experiences with the cocaine water,
Uh-huh.
will they choose the regular water or will they choose the cocaine water? The rats that were isolated chose the cocaine water way more, but the rats that were social actually chose water quite frequently,
Hmm.
because they were getting healthy dopamine from all their people. So I think part of the thing, that dopamine hit when you're clicking like or retweet, I think you're feeling for a second a little less alone.
Yeah, I think it is called social media, and although there's some number of like bots in the ecosystem, it mostly is
Yeah.
actual other humans who are doing
Yeah.
it. So there is a I think I mean that over the past year, I think it's been obvious that as the sort of everyday social connections that we would normally have, were prevented because of the pandemic. People were looking to social media just to like reach out and touch someone. As that, I don't know if you remember that commercial from back in
I
the
sure do. Yeah.
day.
AT&T, was it AT&T?
Yeah, with AT&T or MCI or something. But yeah, just like the I think we're social creatures and we want to have social interactions with other people, and that is like the most natural the most natural thing that humans do. And so social media gives you this sort of simulacrum uh, of the social world in which you can sort of connect to people, but it's mediated through an app that's trying to advertise to you, and is distorted and in all these other ways. I mean, there's no there's no way to like go in the like in traditional social interactions. There's no like going viral, you know.
Mhm.
Like I don't know if like you're at like a party and you tell a joke and the entire room erupts into laughter or something. Maybe that's sort of the equivalent of going
Yeah.
viral. But otherwise, it's like you're mostly interacting like one on one or in very small groups with other people. But there's something like I guess there's something deep in the human psyche, and maybe Robert Wright, with his study of evolutionary psychology, could explain this. Like,
Yeah.
it feels really, really good if you get the whole room like clapping and cheering for you. I guess it elevates
Well,
your social status, and so
and sometimes those people are addicts and they end up committing suicide or something, because there's another place where they can't get the dopamine because they're on a downslope or whatever.
yeah, I mean it's a little bit. I mean the example I just made up is not so dissimilar from like being a stand-up comedian,
Yeah.
where you're like drawing laughter out of a crowd of strangers, and it's well known
Mhm.
that like people who are successful stand-up comedians often have mental health problems, and
Mhm.
like there's a link between depression and being a stand-up comedian that is very deep. So yeah, so and that's like that I guess that's a sort of proto version of what happens on social media, where you're like strangers are reacting to something you do and giving you positive or negative feedback or something. And yeah, and that's like but like being a stand-up comedian is notoriously like very, very difficult, and like you're failing almost all the time, and most people get like no success whatsoever and wash out of it, and there's just like very few people are very, very good at it. And now that's sort of like Twitter allows anyone to, including me, to just write stupid jokes, and occasionally, very, very, very occasionally, you'll get like a big positive response from it.
Aryeh, I love your stupid jokes.
Thank you.
Your Twitter feed is great. Everybody, I'll link to it obviously, but it's just ARYEHCW,
That's
right?
correct. Yeah.
Um, so let's shift gears if you're open to it.
Sure.
I really want to ask you about your experience going to an Ivy League university, if you don't mind talking about it.
Sure.
I went to a state school. I went to University of Northern Iowa, got a master's in English, and I was listening to you talk about you went to Yale. Is that correct?
Yes.
You were talking, I think, to Bob, but I'm not sure about how you went to Yale and the coursework itself wasn't necessarily, you didn't think it wasn't necessarily the most valuable thing about it. You actually kind of wished that you'd done more networking while you're there and more time just soaking up the Yale culture. Is that an accurate
Yeah,
representation?
well, I think that was the conversation I had with Glenn Lowry when I was
That's right.
asking him about, what's the point of college really, and
It
especially
was when,
during the pandemic time when there's certain, you can't, most colleges are not having everyone there at the same time. What are the essential things that happen at college that should be preserved, or maybe what are the things that should be jettisoned? And yeah, so yeah, it's like, what, I mean, I don't understand it myself, even though I went through it, but it's like, why do we encourage children to like work really, really hard in high school and do extracurricular activities and, study and like take special classes so they can do well on standardized tests and so forth, so that they can get into these Ivy League schools? And like, what are they supposed to be doing there that enables them to have success, later in life? I don't quite know the answer to that.
yeah.
But I think, I mean,
Our generation in particular, we're the generation who like went to college without really any prospects for that improving our, I mean, statistically, we're more likely to have a job, but it's not like it was put us on a trajectory to having career success. Let's put it that way.
right. And yeah, I mean, having a college degree is definitely helpful. I'm sure you're more likely to have, various life, positive life outcomes or whatever if you have a college degree than if you don't. And yeah, I just think like why, what was the point? Okay, so you get in, anyone who gets into an Ivy League school, like, obviously is bright, worked very hard in high school, and did like the other like extracurricular stuffs or something, had, it was a prodigy at the bassoon or something. They had something going for them that put them such that the the admissions office let them in. And then
they got in. Yeah.
they got in. And then what were they supposed to do once they were there that was going to help them like have a good life, or what? I think I think I mentioned this on the episode with Glenn, was that I had this like internal sense that I had to have at least a 3.5 GPA.
Yeah.
And that came from, in high school, feeling like I had to get like a 4.0 GPA or something in order to get into a good college. I did that, obviously. But I haven't had it depends what you want to do with your life. If you want to go to grad school or law school, then your transcript matters. No one that I can remember ever asked for my GPA in any job interview, let alone like requested my transcript to see what it actually was. Like, you can lie about your GPA. But no one, I think if you see the Yale, Princeton, or Harvard on a resume, maybe people perk up, but you can,
any job I've ever had, the employer was kind of like vaguely like, oh, he went past high school, so that's good. That means he's intelligent and a hard worker or something, right? But it's not like my coworkers necessarily even had degrees. So it was, I don't know. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just adding.
Yeah. So one of the one of the things, I think I was thinking about this and wanted to talk to Glenn about it. He talks a lot about affirmative action, and he has become a critic of affirmative action, even though he once supported it. And, he kind of talks about how, there's students who are accepted. I think he's mainly thinking about like the kind of graduate economics programs that he instructs in. Like, there's students who are admitted as part of not an explicit racial quota, but they're let in because with maybe somewhat worse grades or scores. And then like, it turns out that they just can't hack it. And they're not as good. And then maybe they get discouraged and drop out, or if they had gone to like sort of maybe a tier down graduate program, they would have succeeded there. But the fact that they are at an elite one, that just can't do it. And, but that is, that is like sort of a very, that's like 1 or 2% of, people are going into that sort of elite graduate education. And one can attend a very highly ranked school and basically sort of coast by once you get in, because they, at least Harvard, Yale, Princeton, it's very hard to get kicked out because of academics. Once you're in, you're basically in. They like having that, there's something in the U.S. News and World Report ranking that says like the percentage of people who graduate within 5 years or something. And, it's like 98%. So
yeah, they won't have a high number.
Yeah. So it's hard to flunk out. Once you're in Harvard, it's hard to flunk out of Harvard. You kind of have to try or have some sort of like severe like personal crisis or something.
Speaking of comedians, Conan O'Brien once joked, I was at Harvard, and there are like 1,000 Unabombers there. They're like all these freaks. They're like,
So when you're at an elite school, there's some group of people who are continue to be very academically motivated. And then there's some people there who are maybe just like, oh, I'm in, let's just have fun. And they want to like get drunk or smoke weed or whatever, party. And then there's like more people in the middle who are maybe trying hard. But anyway, I came to think that I worked too hard in college, and and why did I work so hard? And, I should have been partying more. I should have been just hanging out more instead of having a sense that like I had to do really well. And that was, entirely like within myself, that pushed me that way. And then I think after I graduated, and like, as I said, I did pretty well, but like I didn't get straight A's. I was more like A minus, B plus kind of thing. And then once I graduated, I had a much harder time navigating the job market than I thought I would. And probably there were things that I didn't understand about networking or presenting yourself or how I should interact with, people older than me or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like things I didn't understand that maybe someone from a different type of family or something would have understood more. And it didn't matter that I had gotten an A in my Canterbury Tales class or something. Unless
you like Chaucer.
Well, I did. The thing was, I did mostly enjoy my classes, and I was an English major also. And so in a way, like, you can, if you're like a history major, they give you all this stuff to read, and there's some of it you probably can just skim or something.
Sure.
If you're an English major and you're like skimming the works of literature, you're kind of like, what's the point? Like, you might as well just actually read them. So I did. In those classes, I always read everything, and read all of War and Peace and Moby Dick and stuff like that. And so I enjoyed it, and I'm glad that I did read those books at a time when, that was sort of my job. Whereas today, if I tried to read Moby Dick, I probably would fall asleep within 10 minutes because my things like Twitter and so forth have ruined my sense of concentration. And so I'm glad I did all that. But at the same time, I should have been, I wish in retrospect I had chilled out more or just decided it doesn't, like, getting the grade doesn't really matter. Because what's weird is you have, in order to get into that kind of school, you have to care about your grades. Either if you don't, you're either like an athlete or a legacy admission or something. And then it's, once you have that mindset internalized, it just like makes sense to keep on doing that, even if it isn't maybe the main thing.
Yeah, if I had it to do over again, I would join the Greek system. I had this Animal House kind of idea about what frats were. And indeed, some of the big ones are like that. But there are also, there was a music fraternity for music majors. I mean, there are academic type fraternities that I could have joined, and I would have a network of people from, my dad's an auto body repair guy. My mom's a paralegal. It's like I could have had a social network that would last over time by being a member of a community. And I mean, there's still options out there for me to join guilds or organizations, but if I'd had it over to do it again, I probably would have done that. But let me, I feel bad as a host. I'm always like making comment interjections like anybody cares.
That's okay. I mean, I can tend to ramble on, with if not interrupted.
Well, really, I mean, what is this but an exercise in narcissism after
right.
all? I want to ask you though, you said you did like your English classes and you did do the reading, and you're right. You're 100% right. Like the farther away you get from college, the harder it is to devote time to reading great works. And you really do kind of have to get it done, or at least get your life of reading started by 25, or you're not going to do it. Um, and so I really want to ask you this though, because you said this in passing on that show. You took a class with Harold Bloom. Is that correct?
Yes.
I've read like 4 Harold Bloom books. I'm like a big fan, and you've got to give me some anecdotes from that experience. It was probably, you're probably going to completely pop my
Okay, well,
icon bubble.
I do have.
Please be an iconoclast. Please destroy my
Okay,
myth.
so I actually do have a Harold Bloom anecdote that is definitely iconoclastic. Okay,
Awesome.
So you know, he would in the time I was there in the early 2000s, he, I think, would only teach 2 seminar classes per semester, and he didn't teach lecture classes anymore. And so my senior year, I was taking a class that was part of satisfying the like senior requirement. You had to either do like an independent study to write an essay, like a thesis, basically, that would be on the longer end, or you could take a class that was specifically for seniors, where you would write like a 20-page essay instead of a 50-page essay or something. So I took a class on Shakespearean tragedies with a professor named David Quint, and I saw that that Bloom was going to be teaching a seminar on the tragedies and the romances, I think, and I realized that it wouldn't make sense to actually try to take the class because I was already taking this Shakespeare senior seminar, but I went to the first one and sat in, and then at the end of the class, I just went up and asked him, "Can I just audit this class?" And he was like, "Yeah, sure." So I audited it. I don't think I was even ever, there was nothing official. I essentially just went to the class and like sat in.
Sure.
And it was a very interesting experience. And so he would have been in his 70s at this point, and this was in 2005. He seemed to be kind of like in ill health already, even though he lived like another 12 or so years. And so it was, seminar room, people are sitting around a big table. He would come in every class. He would be like wrapped in multiple jackets and scarves and like tote bags and stuff, and it would take him some length of time to like get everything off. And then he would sit down, and he would ask a question about whatever the text. It was usually doing two of the different plays per week. He'd ask a question about Romeo and Juliet, and someone in the class would sort of timidly raise their hand, and he would call on them, and they would offer an answer. And then he would say, "No, that's not right." And then he would talk for 15 or 20 minutes. And so even though it was, a seminar with like 15 or 20 people in it, it was mostly just like he did 90% of it was just him talking. And he was a very, very good talker. So it was interesting. And I was always, because I wasn't like actually in the class, I always sat like on one of the chairs, like against the wall. And I never raised my hand the entire class, both because I wasn't actually a student in the class, and I was scared that he would, that I would be made to be a fool. And actually, I had a friend who once answered something, and he was like, Bloom really like shot him down hard, and
that sucks.
And yeah, so you had to be somewhat brave. I mean, he wouldn't always disagree with the student. I'm exaggerating that, but like he this was a guy who really considered himself the expert, and maybe he was, like the expert in planet Earth on William Shakespeare. So his declarations were, as close to the word of God as we can get. So it was just kind of a strange atmosphere. One of the other strange things was that there was always a group of different people coming to the class, every time, and they would often sit like against the back wall. and they were like visitors to campus or former students or just I don't even know who. It was like, coming to see the great man in his element. And so these people, actually sometimes they would raise their hand and contribute, but usually not. But usually it was kind of just like, yeah, like if a professor was visiting campus or something, they would come see Bloom do his thing. So, and they would often at the end of the class like come up and like shake his hand or say like, "Oh, Professor Bloom, like I had you as a professor 30 years ago, etc."
Sure.
Okay, so then there was one occasion where we were the text for the week was King Lear, and Bloom was saying that Bloom said that he had never seen a successful production of King Lear.
He was always saying shit like that.
Yes, and then he said he'd also never seen a successful production of Hamlet.
Yeah.
And he said these plays, it's impossible. Like they can't be staged. It's like it's an artistic failure. Like every single production I've seen is somehow an artistic failure.
Which makes you think, I mean, was Shakespeare's run of it also a failure?
Well, so what I was thinking at that time was like, or I was just thinking, like, yeah, Shakespeare, he was, he wanted to put on like productions that would be financially successful. Like he was both artist and businessman. Like he had a share in his company, and why would he write a play that was meant to be staged that was impossible to stage? It didn't make any sense to me. So I kind of like got up my courage to ask this, but I didn't ask it during the class. And so I decided I would ask him after the class. And so there was always like this line of people, both regular students and these like well-wishers who were different every time, like lining up at the end of the class to like ask him a question or say hi or something. So I was at the end of the line on this particular class, and it's going through, and he's like very, very slowly putting his scarves and his multiple jackets back on. And then finally, I get there. I'm the last one in line. It's just me and him, and he's like gotten all of his jackets and everything back on. And so I asked him the question. I'm like, yeah, why? Like I just said, why would Shakespeare, write something that couldn't be produced when he wanted to be a financial success? And so we're kind of
legitimately asking.
Yeah. So we're like walking out of the room at this point and into the hallway, and he's saying, so he answers something about how the world of the Elizabethan stage is like totally inaccessible to us today. As is well known, the female parts are played by teenage boys, and I think he called the actors screamers, and he's like, it just, there's no way for us to know what it was actually like, and so it's kind of like a black box. We can't know. So as he's saying this, we're walking down the hall, and he's talking, and then he like points to the bathroom and starts going to the bathroom, and I like pause, and he like waves me to keep on coming, and he's like talking the whole time. So then he goes in the bathroom, I follow, and he,
I don't like where this is going.
Then he goes to the urinal and uses the urinal.
Okay.
Well, I'm standing there in the bathroom, and
I was worried he was going to go to the stall.
He goes to the urinal, thankfully. But he's like talking the entire time. He finishes at the urinal, zips up, goes to the sink, washes his hands, all very slowly because he's an old man. And
at least he washed his hands.
Yes,
that's good.
And he's like still talking as though nothing is happening to interrupt him. So then we walk out of the bathroom, back into the hallway, out the door, onto the sidewalk, and he finally finishes up, and basically, just gave that answer more or less that like, there's no way we can know. It's just so different. And so like, he heads off one direction, I head off in the other. I was like, wow, I can't believe this just happened. I probably didn't say a word the whole time, but I just saw like the greatest living English critic take a leak right in front of me. And then, so I was like, okay, I'm never going to forget this. And then, so I just would tell the story to friends whenever he came up. But then after he passed away a couple years ago, I tweeted it out in a short version, and like 3 separate people messaged me saying the same exact thing happened to me.
Oh my God.
So this was just normal. This was like nothing to him. He just was all, whatever. He would just talk while using the bathroom, and it's probably like this because he was, he probably like always had the same exact classroom, like close to his office or whatever, and like it's probably always the same exact bathroom. So
always had to pee. It was always after a seminar.
Exactly. So I said they should like name the bathroom like in his honor. Afterwards. So okay, so that's my Harold Bloom anecdote, but it was he was very good, and he was he would like talk in like paragraphs, and he had this sort of very mild way of talking, very soft spoken, which was somewhat different, clashing with his sort of pronouncement, sort of like this is good, this is bad, like I'm going to define what the Western canon is kind of attitude. But he always seemed like a nice guy, and
a soft-spoken polemicist.
Yes, he was soft-spoken, and yeah, I'm glad that I I'm glad that I had that. I did audit that class and got to see him, because I felt like if I had like had the chance to see him and then didn't do it, then I would have regretted it. So
sure,
and I've read I read in subsequent years. I read his Shakespeare Creation of the Human book, and also he did this late series on various Shakespeare characters. That I read some of them, and I think he called himself Brontosaurus Bloom in his later years, that he was like the last
amiable Brontosaurus, he would say.
He was sort of like the last of the breed of like worshiping the great like artists of the Western canon, and
right.
And but I think I don't know, he definitely an interesting guy, and I certainly I just that's my that's my story. Rest in peace, Professor Bloom, and
he was famous. He just had so many passages memorized, and he started reading at a very young age, and he just had a whole life where he was just living with these texts in his mind.
Yes,
his writing is very interesting that way.
A couple times he would just recite a passage either from Shakespeare or from a poem, during the class, and he seemed to have this, like superhuman memory for poetry and literature, and I think he's I don't know, he's when you read, did you ever read any of those books that are like, there's one on Falstaff, there's one on
I haven't. I read Hamlet Poem Unlimited.
Yes. It's kind of like he did that for a couple other,
that's a very good book,
characters. So these are short works, but a lot of it is he quotes extensively from the play. So it's almost a way to sort of like reread the play and get some commentary on it, because at least a third of the text is just lines from the play, or from plays. So if you want to like dip back into Macbeth or Henry IV Part 1, then you can like do it through these I think they're called Shakespeare's Great Personalities or something like that. And these are like some of the last stuff he published before he passed away.
Man, that brings up some interesting things. Well, one thing is just the business aspect. If he was a writer, and I understand he had a son who had some kind of illness, and he needed to pay for care, and so he needed to publish a lot to do
I think that's right. Yes, he had a son who needed like care, like 24-hour care or something like that.
Yeah.
I think it came out somewhat after he died, but he was massively prolific, but I think possibly he wasn't actually writing himself everything that had his name on it, because he had graduate assistants who would work for him. And
can you imagine being a ghostwriter for Harold Bloom? That's the dream gig, man.
Well, because he did this thing where he did like introductions to a series of texts. And so there's like hundreds of those. So I don't know if maybe that's the sort of thing where really it wasn't him doing the bulk of the work, and it was more like a collective thing. Who knows?
So many things you could talk about with a figure like that. One thing I do want to ask you, though, is just you going. My anecdote about Bloom had nothing to do with meeting him, obviously, but I had when I was in grad school, I was, like I said, I was really into Bloom, and I would mention him when I would be writing responses to prompts in a Milton class I was taking. And my professor, Dr. Jesse Swan, one day walked up to me and threw a Xerox onto my desk before class and said, "Here's an article about your hero," and it was Naomi Wolf's piece about Harold Bloom coming onto her.
Right.
And, yeah,
I believe came out
and,
when I was an undergrad.
yeah, and he was like, I visited him during office hours, and I was like, "Wow, it sounds like there's a problem at Yale." There's no problem at Yale. I just don't want you to hero worship. I want you to see he's a human being.
Mhm.
And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." But in the context of what you were saying, he was like he was the last vocal advocate for the sort of great books philosophy of Western literature, right? It was like there's this philosophy that there's a cherished canon, right? And we need to revere it, right? And we need to teach it. But there are a lot of very legitimate political arguments against that, right? Like feminist and all sorts of identity politic
Mhm.
takes and culture war. Culture war stuff isn't just frivolous stuff. It's people want to have a canon that they feel is integrative for the whole culture, and obviously, to sound like Jordan Peterson for a second, Harold Bloom would be like white cis heterosexist male patriarchal, right? Like,
Mhm.
and it's I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but I just want to hear your comments because you are a very thoughtful, considerate person who sees value in lots of different cultural phenomena.
Mhm.
And what do you think is being lost, if anything, from the kind of shift in the university starting kind of with the 60s? I mean, do you think that we're losing something essential, or do you think, kind of like Bob in Praise of Barbarians and Non-Zero, it's like the ideas are out there, humanity's gonna be fine, we're not losing anything essential?
Yeah, it's a deep question. And it's hard to give a concise answer. I mean, one thing I would just point out with Bloom, he in some way he was, the white straight, man defending the works of largely white straight men, but
Uh-huh.
he also was Jewish, and I believe his first
Sure.
language was Yiddish. Like Yiddish was
It was.
spoken at his
Yeah,
home, so he
that's
was
correct.
an outsider in some ways. And if you there's actually a photo. So Yale sends me the alumni magazine. They did an issue on the 50th anniversary of coeducation, which I think would have been 2018, and they did a particular story about this woman. I think is her name Marie Boroff. She was the first woman tenured English professor.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and so there's a photo of the English department, from like 1964 or something, and it's very obvious that there are two people who stick out: this woman and Harold Bloom, because Bloom is
Oh.
like short. I know he looks a little, his suit doesn't fit as well as everyone else is like a wasp basically.
Mhm.
And yeah,
Uh-huh.
he's obviously, he's like, possibly there were other Jews in this photo, but he just looks very different. This short, chubby guy with kind of somewhat
Yeah.
crazy hair, even in the early 60s. So he stood out in that way. So yeah, it wasn't just like he was defending his own, like patrimony in all ways. And, he championed people who were, uh, like Philip Roth, who
Uh-huh.
challenged the canon in various ways.
Oh, sure.
So I mean, but in general, I think it's definitely complicated. And
Well, he would argue, I thought persuasively, of all the people you're gonna demonize poets. Like, why don't you just like, let's not demonize poets. If you want to add extra authors, great. But if a poet's great, then it's not like the poet is Alexander the Great or somebody like Genghis Khan or something.
mhm.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Arya.
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways it's kind of like gets back to what we were talking about earlier with the is culture sort of like a just a frivolous thing that doesn't really matter. And in some ways, like if you're arguing about the what should be taught in English classes, in some ways, like I don't know, can we like work on getting everyone like like access to like free healthcare, like before we like. There's some things that are more
Sure.
important than
Yeah.
than the canon. But I think it is. I'm not. Like I said, I'm open to all sorts of cultural products from you know comic books to Shakespeare and back. And I think it is. There's things that like would have been taught in literature classes, 50 or 75 years ago that just kind of fell away, and like no one like thinks about them or mourns them anymore. And sometimes if you go to like
Yeah.
used bookstores, you see a lot of works by what's this guy's name, like Galsworthy. There was some English writer who wrote like 30 novels, in the late 19th century, and no one thinks about him or reads him anymore. Just like faded away, and so.
Edmund Spencer's Fairy Queen, what a gorgeous work, right? But do you need to read it? If you're interested in that era, absolutely read it. But yeah.
Yeah, we actually did. So in the class that you had, there was a requirement to take to be an English major. We did read Fairy Queen. But yeah, what is the point of reading Fairy Queen? I don't know. Like, it's hard to define what the utility of these things are. In some ways,
once you get into conversations about utility, it sort of does start to get preposterous. Because, like you said, is there ever a utilitarian purpose in this? It is a perplexing question, right? It's like,
yeah, I have no answer. I have no answer to that question.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Why do these things at all? I don't know. Like, there's obviously some human impulse to tell these type of stories, and like pass them along and share them. But if there's there's a lot of joy you can get out of reading Shakespeare and stuff, and like there's things you can maybe learn about the human condition or something. But
sure,
you can also just not read them and probably move along with your life and be perfectly fine. Like there was long stretches of time where probably his work wasn't translated into any other languages, and so people got through their lives not knowing him. At the same time, like it's such a the last of it like undergirds the language and metaphors we tell each other, and certain stories where like it does make sense to have read Hamlet and so forth. I mean, there's an old joke that's like an elderly woman, her whole life she was like she wanted to read Hamlet, but she was like too nervous. She thought she wouldn't understand it, and finally, she's like 90 years old. She finally reads it, and her son says, "What do you think of Hamlet?" And she said, "Well, it was okay, but it's just a book of quotes." Because everything is just like worked into the culture some other way.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, some of the fight that I see a lot of energy behind right now is whether you see this on Twitter, at least, whether sort of canonical work should be taught to middle and high school students, or whether like contemporary YA literature should be used instead. Yeah. And people get really, really exercised about this. And you could try a mix. I was especially in middle school, I don't know what it was like for you. We didn't read a lot of things that I think would be considered to be part of a canon. Like we read things like Tuck Everlasting and the Mix-Up Files of Mrs. Baisley Frankweiler and Madeline L'Engle, and like like these books that were written in the 30 years after World War II, and somehow like the middle school like bought a bunch of copies of them, and like they were sitting in the storeroom, and that's what we would read. So it wasn't like we were reading Pride and Prejudice versus the latest YA thing back in my day. So I don't know. I mean, I think I'm open to mixing things and giving teachers individual autonomy to sort of experiment with what they want, and but the people who are like, I don't know, super moralizing about it, and again, this is like a way to go viral on Twitter, is if you're very moralizing about your statements, that like this is horrible, this is great, or whatever, is I would not I would want to distance myself from that.
Well, speaking of Shakespeare, I mean, like I remember, they taught Romeo and Juliet, in high school, and we watched the film as well. And, they probably a lot of logic to that. These are themes that are relevant to people of that age group. And certainly I was and it was right when Leo DiCaprio and Claire Danes did that version with Baz Luhrmann directing, and John Leguizamo was in it. And I was really caught up in that. I was really taken by it, but I didn't understand a lick of the language. And wasn't aware of any of the irony or any of the cultural commentary. I just thought that, like, my little relationship with my girlfriend that I was in love with, to the point that I would die for her,
Right.
like, was that even good for me to be experiencing as a teenager? Did it get me into Shakespeare for life? No. The thing that got me into Shakespeare for life was reading the Summer's Day sonnet in my 11th or 12th grade
Huh.
English class. It wasn't a play that did it, so it was a sonnet. But I digress. But yeah, I mean, it's like this argument that, like, our humanity, our individual spirit, our wisdom as a culture is all built into our cultural heritage, and that's expressed by the great works. That falls apart once you get into the nuts and bolts of public school curricula.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, probably Romeo and Juliet and like Macbeth and Midsummer Night's Dream are very often
Yeah,
taught
Macbeth, sure.
in high schools because they're on the shorter side, have some exciting parts, and are somewhat.
Now that you mention that, I do remember liking Macbeth in high school.
Yeah, Macbeth. I think Macbeth is probably the tragedy that's most often taught in high school, though of course Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy as well. But of the four big tragedies, I'm thinking it's most often Macbeth. I think because it's the shortest.
And now that we say that, I also read Julius Caesar actually in a different class. So now that I'm piecing it together, I actually read quite a bit of Shakespeare.
Yeah, I think I didn't read Julius Caesar until college, but I think that one is often taught in high school. Also, the ones I read in high school were Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and Hamlet. And yeah, I think they operate. The reason they endure, or one of the reasons they endure, is that they operate at these different levels where you can watch the Baz Luhrmann Romeo and Juliet, and like it's exciting, and there's cool stuff, and they use guns instead of knives and stuff, and but yeah, the plot appeals to teenagers, and because the characters are teenagers. But then once you maybe like take Romeo and Juliet in a college class, you're like, oh, like God, Romeo's such a moron. Like, why, like what a dunce. So there's all sorts of, and probably if as someone approaching middle age, if I reread it today, I would take different things from it. So that's, I mean, that's one of the great things about Shakespeare is how many different possible interpretations there are, and how just different people can take different things from it, and in some ways, it's like a lot of the battle over what sort of works to assign to children and teenagers is like, they want to, our African American students going to want to read about mostly white characters or something, or these things that seem totally outdated. But with Shakespeare, you can kind of do anything you want with it, and it's not like, like a lot of the Shakespeare plays take place in Italy, and it's not like we relate to them in some like special way. Well, it's not like Italian Americans that relate to them in some special way, I assume. Like that sort of that level of identity doesn't really matter that much. And of course you can, there's colorblind casting, or you could do, I guess like a month or two before the pandemic, I saw a all black, all female production of Measure for Measure.
Oh wow!
At Joe's Pub in New York, that was pretty good. So yeah, cool. So these texts are very open to various interpretations. I think maybe part of the thing that's annoying about when people were talking about like the Western canon, and maybe even the way that Bloom was like, he's the one who knows the true answer to these things. It's like, no, there's no there's no real true answer, and what would it even matter if there was? Like, it's, I don't know, the experience of reading it or seeing it or imbibing it, is part of it, and then you think about it, and maybe it stays with you, or maybe you forget that you ever read it. But yeah, it's not like I mean, these aren't like Aesop's fables or something where it's like the lesson of Hamlet is, don't kill your don't kill your brother and marry his wife or something. Like, there's a lot of difference. It goes much deeper than that, and just this idea that like we need these didactic works that teach some moral lesson is I think sort of way too simple.
Yeah, that's funny because I mean Bloom kind of tried to set himself against the sort of William Bennett kind of, I think that was his name, who wrote the Book of Virtues or
Yes.
whatever. Like he said, I'm not that guy. I'm not. But when you look at how Bloom thinks about quote unquote wisdom literature, in some ways he's just a more intellectualized version of that very thing. This has been a really fantastic conversation, Aryeh. I'm really so grateful that you took the time to talk to me.
Oh well, I appreciate you you taking the time, and yeah, this has been wide ranging.
It really has. It really has. Everybody should definitely check out your Twitter feed. Again, it's ARYEHCW.
Correct.
And also check out Culturally Determined, obviously.
Culturally Determined. So
Anything,
you can find that, using your regular it's on Blogging Heads. You can either watch it on video, Blogging Heads, or on YouTube, or you can just listen to it like a regular podcast. Wherever you get your podcast, just search for Culturally Determined.
Well, thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you so much. You too.